So thanks Luke for the announcement and for that brilliant talk. I've been crying. So anyway, so my talk's titled "Tell Your Story, Your Component Story with Storybook." So Luke already mentioned who I am. So I'm a senior full stack software engineer at Infact, and freelance also under Spectorium Limited. And my primary expertise lies in .NET and Angular, but I do a lot of Node and Rails on the side as well. So first of all, let's define what are components that we're talking about here. So here I'm talking about components as in UI components. So these are independent and reusable bits of UI logic, usually represented by custom HTML elements, and these UI components are core concepts in Angular, Vue, and React. So this is how I felt when I first found out about components in Angular and React, and it got me really, really excited to actually work with them. Why? So for this sort of reason. So it allowed, after years of working with jQuery and Backbone and just sort of custom build vanilla JavaScript frameworks, here came the tools that allowed to build reusable pieces of UI logic, allowed to easily organize functionality into sort of hierarchies and clearly defined use cases. It allowed to be more effective in communicating the intent of the components that we build between members of the team and sort of external stakeholders. And finally, it allowed to actually finally easily package those reusable bits of UI logic to distribute it externally. However, as with anything, components came with challenges. And usually we start with building the first component, the second, the third, the 10th, then is the 100th, then 200th, and we get into some really sort of complex areas where maintaining large number of components becomes an issue. Understanding and managing component hierarchies can become a problem. Understanding how the components interact with each other, how they link to each other. Communicating the component's intent becomes an issue because we all remember what the component was doing at the time we were writing it. Then it's left for months, maybe years, and then we don't know what it's doing anymore. And prototyping and developing new components becomes harder because we need to bring a lot more components together to actually be able to try something new. Documenting to the rescue. So obviously, documenting our components can help us enormously in fighting some of these challenges. Documentation can help us understand what each component is doing and understand it both at when we actually write it and after we come back to it later. It can make it much easier to communicate components' intent to other team members. It will increase discoverability of our components, both internally and if we distribute them externally. And it should improve the maintainability of our components. Documentation comes with its own challenges. It's first of all can be a laborious task depending on sort of what kind of documentation strategies we choose. It can be difficult to maintain because documentation is not code, so somebody has to have the process in place to actually maintain this properly. And for UI components specifically, it can be sometimes hard to describe UI components functionality purely in text. And finally, it can be pretty boring to documentation. So, how to document components? There are a few sort of types of documentation that exist for any sort of code that you write. We can document outside of our code, which is probably not a great idea, but we can have Evernote, Word, whatever word processing software we use to create documentation. We can and should document our components in code using the best practices for the framework of your choice, or obviously for JavaScript, or if you're using TypeScript. Or we can use documentation tools in combination with documentation in code. This is some of the tools that are widely used in React and Angular. So Build, Style Guide, List Docs, Storybook, and TypeDoc. Today, I would like to talk to you about Storybook. So Storybook is a open source UI the components of development framework. And what Storybook gives us, it allows us to build UI components in isolation. It allows us to document use cases as stories. It allows to use Markdown in code for writing documentation. It also allows us to mock hard-to-reach use cases, and we also can reuse the stories that we write in UI testing. Why I think using Storybook is a good idea? Because we can produce interactive documentation very quickly and efficiently. We can build static documentation sites in a matter of minutes. We can have our documentation act as test cases, which means that documentation doesn't stay as a burden that needs to be maintained. It becomes part of our whole development lifecycle. And we can use Storybook for prototyping components. So the whole issue of not being able to isolate a particular component to just try it, prototype it, and then show it to the world. And finally, Storybook now supports all major JavaScript frameworks, so including React, Vue, and Angular, which opens the gates for a wider reach. So just I'll demonstrate a quick demo. This is a lightning talk, and basically, to add Storybook to your React application, you just need one npx command. So if you were to use Angular, you would just replace React with Angular. This basically will create a project. Well, I've added Storybook to a default create React app, and essentially by default it creates a folder called stories, places some default stories in there. I have added a custom simple component called vote counter, and added some associated stories for that vote counter component. Just to show you how. So yeah, I also added 2 add-ons for Storybook. One is called knobs, which allows us to add sort of interactive bits to our components, so we can actually try out different values for props and etc. And the other one is called docs, which adds some more customizations to how the actual final documentation will look. So here's an example of the vote. Here's the code for the vote counter component. So it's a very, very simple component that uses React hooks, and it literally has just a title property that can come in as a prop, and it has an internal sort of like state that can be incremented by using a very simple button. So we've placed some standard JavaScript sort of documentation comments to the actual component. So just and we placed a documentation to the actual definition of the prop. So I've used prop types in this case, but if you are using TypeScript, for example, in your workflow, so then you can just place those, describe the interfaces for your props eventually. And here is how the stories look for that particular component. So the latest versions of Storybook, in latest versions they've changed the format of writing stories. So whereas before you used to call all sorts of different custom methods from the Storybook API to actually build your stories, now you can use this so-called component story format to actually write your components as very to write your stories as sort of very simple variables that just actually denote what you're doing. So in here we have the default export, which defines the title for our sort of stories, for the sort of the overarching title for the collection of the stories. In this case, it will be the stories about the vote counter. We actually add some custom Storybook logic to actually allow us to have interactive bits of UI for passing our props, and then we just describe what is the component that these stories are related to, and this is, I just showed an example of how you would add a subtitle to your documentation. Finally, there are 3 stories here. So a basic one that will just output sort of the result of sort of passing this sort of component logic. The one with title, where we pass a hard-coded title as a prop, and the other one with a dynamic title, where we basically pass a function from the knobs library that allows us to actually interact with the story. So finally, we just need to hit npm run storybook. So which are these are convenient scripts that are added by that first sort of command I showed to you. And this will produce a static website that looks like this. Can everybody see? So I can just do that. So essentially you can see you get a nice left-hand side menu. This got automatically produced based on the stories that I've specified in my vote counter stories file. And you can see the 3 stories got added. So I can go into them. You can see that we straight away see how the component looks and works. It's all interactive, so we can see that our state is actually getting updated. And then if we add knobs, basically it means that we can actually start passing the values to the story straight away from here. Finally, the docs page is also generated automatically based on the definition of that story. So you can see that you can see the subtitle, the actual comment that I've placed on the vote counter component appears here as the description of the component. The subtitle added to the documentation appears there, and all the 3 of our stories sort of display as stories in sort of visual format, allowing us to very clearly see what the code is doing. For every single story as well, we can see the code to know how it was implemented. And because I've used prop types in React and I've added some comments to the properties, it also builds a table of our properties just there. So pretty simple to generate documentation with 0 effort. Okay. Yeah, so where to go next from here? So basically, I would encourage you to visit the official documentation. The documentation of Storybook is really good. People have used it for a while now, so there is loads of help in the GitHub issues. You can look at some examples. They have a nice sort of examples page of showing where it's used in the wild, and I was quite impressed to see the gov.uk website, for example, has definition of their components in a storybook format as well. And then you try adding it to your project and yeah, have a play with it. So thank you very much.